Hier von mir, ne?
Ja, Begell, das ist immer Begell. Haviv immer Begell.
No, it's really not. I'm Christoph. I'm the husband of Honey.
Beneidenswert.
Aber du warst ja auch so fleißig. Also ich finde, ne? Jetzt mal. Ja, das glaube ich, man produktiv, aber nicht alt.
Sehr, sehr anwältig. Sehr, sehr anwältig.
Das ist Begell und Zora.
Begell.
He met you.
Yes, I edited the talk and I wrote down his notes. You're in my book. Okay.
Frau Viefhaus. Never seen you over here.
We heard about your adventures.
Ich begrüße mit besonderer Freude den Autor Dr. Malkes Good. Seine Eltern, Frau Dr. Pearl und Herrn William Good. Seine Familie und die Gäste aus Litauen, Frau Dr. Marianne Viefhaus, die ehrenamtliche Archivarin der Technischen Universität Darmstadt. Sie hat einen ganz erheblichen Anteil an der Recherche. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the presentation of Michael Good's book, The Search for Major Plagge. With great pleasure and pride, I welcome today's special guest, the author Michael Good, his parents, Pearl and William Good, the guest from Lithuania, and Dr. Marianne Viefhaus, the archivist from the Technical University of Darmstadt.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, es ist großartig, dass Sie in so großer Zahl zu dieser Buchpräsentation gekommen sind und ich möchte Sie herzlich begrüßen. Es ist uns eine besondere Freude, dass wir Michael Good vorstellen dürfen, den Autor des Buches. Und gleichzeitig bitte ich um Entschuldigung, dass ich mit einigen Handicaps versehen bin. Es hatte mich eine Krankheit ziemlich betroffen. Michael Good wurde 1957 geboren und er hat eine Zwillingsschwester und ist verheiratet mit Susan, einer ganz reizenden und besonders liebenswürdigen Frau. Sie haben 2 gemeinsame Kinder, einen Sohn Jonathan und eine Tochter Rebecca, die, wenn ich die Informationen richtig verstanden habe, gerade die Schule abgeschlossen hat. Michael Good arbeitet zusammen mit der Plagge Research Group seit etwa 1999. Und er hat sich als Head unserer Gruppe erwiesen. Der immer wieder unglaublich intensive und erstaunliche Michael Good ist Allgemeinarzt und ich habe mich sehr oft gefragt, wann er eigentlich seine Arbeit als Arzt ausführte. Er hat sich um unsere Research-Arbeit ungeheuer bemüht und er hat das Buch über Major Plagge nebenher geschrieben. Also, ich weiß nicht wann. Ich kenne eigentlich niemanden, der in solcher Intensität sich um ein Thema gekümmert hat. Außerdem ist Michael ein Computerfreak. Er macht das sehr oft und sehr interessiert. Und ich habe ihn jetzt in den letzten Tagen immer mit so einem kleinen Computer gesehen. Das abends oder. Also, sein Buch, das er geschrieben hat, ist außerordentlich spannend und spannend geschrieben und ist besonders geeignet, gerade auch für junge Menschen. Es wäre schön, wenn die deutschen Verleger sich entschließen könnten, Michaels Buch in Deutsch zu veröffentlichen und auch eine englische Ausgabe zu unterstützen. Also jedenfalls, wir sind sehr, sehr glücklich über Michaels Tätigkeit und seine Freundschaft, die er uns gewidmet hat. Ich kann gar nicht genug dankbar dafür sein, dass Michael uns als Freunde akzeptiert. Und wir wünschen ihm recht viel Erfolg mit seinem Buch.
Well, I would first like to say what an absolute pleasure it is to be here in Darmstadt, Germany, giving a talk about this remarkable man that all of us in the Plagge Research Group have been pursuing for all these years. It's been a very joyous week for all of us, having gone to Jerusalem, to Yad Vashem, to seeing so much attention given to this story. And it really is a pleasure to see so many interested people here in Plagge's hometown of Darmstadt. Now I'd like to begin my talk by going back to where this started for our family in June of 1999. We decided to take a trip to Vilnius, Lithuania, where my parents, William and Pearl Good, were born. And we were there to see where our family came from, where they grew up, and to hear their stories of survival during the Holocaust. And this was a difficult trip for all of us emotionally, to go back to this place where there were so many memories and ghosts. And yet, after overcoming these emotional obstacles, we arrived in Vilnius, and first began with my father's story. And we had the opportunity to hear how he survived a miraculous escape from death when he was taken to be executed at the killing grounds of Panari, and then how he escaped into the forests outside of Vilnius. And we went and met some remarkable families, two families, the Pashkovskis and the Gasparovich, simple peasant families who lived in the woods, who risked their lives to hide my father and grandfather for 3 years in their attics, in their barns, giving them food, knowing that if they were caught hiding enemies of the state, that the whole family would have been killed immediately. And as we stood before them, I could, one, feel very emotional myself to see these people who had risked so much. I mean, my wife, Susan, and I talked and thought, would we ever do such a thing, risk our children for, for others? But I also saw that this story was important to them. When I looked in their eyes, I could see so much pride that here was this former teenager, a 17-year-old who'd been this scared young boy with his father, and here, 55 years later, he returned as a 75-year-old man, bringing his children and grandchildren to show the fruits of their labor. And it was a very emotional meeting, and it was important for both of our families. It was important for our family to understand how it is that we exist, and it was also important for their family to understand the great things that they were capable of. The next day, we followed my mother's story, and she took us first to the deserted streets of the Vilna ghetto, which 55 years after the war was still a ghost town, as if a toxic mist had hung over the area and no one wanted to move there. And then my mother took us to the HKP, HKP labor camp, and there she told me the story of this mysterious but benevolent army major, Major Plagge, who she told us had for 3 years protected his Jewish prisoners from the grasp of the SS and saved her life, the life of my grandparents, and 250 other Jewish prisoners at the HKP labor camp. And as I listened to her tell this story, I asked her, well, Mom, what happened to him? We met Dad's people yesterday. That was very, important. What happened to this man? And she said, I don't know. He retreated with the German army in July of 1944 and disappeared into the chaos of war. And no one's heard of him since. And so as we left Vilnius, I was left with questions. I wondered, who was this Major Plagge? Why was he, a staff officer in the Wehrmacht, working to save Jewish lives when the rest of his society and the rest of the Germans that we were aware of in Vilnius had been so committed to exterminating the Jews of Vilna? And I was also very concerned to know whether his family knew of his good deeds. I had seen the day before how important it was for the Pashkovsky and the Gasparovich families to hear this story and know what their family members had done. And so I wondered whether Major Plagge's family knew of his good work. There were over 1 million German soldiers killed during the last year of the war. It was very possible that he may have been killed and never come home. Perhaps, I thought, his family only knows that he was the commander of a Jewish concentration camp where hundreds of Jews died, and that perhaps they thought that he was a perpetrator. And this really bothered me. And so as I ruminated about these questions, I decided that I would have to try to find this Major Plagge. Now, this was a difficult task. when I talked to my mother, to her friends like Bill Begell, who's here with us tonight, they had all been children during the war. All the adults had since passed away, and no one knew his first name, and no one knew where he was from. No one knew where he was when he was born. Even if their parents had been alive, it's not clear that they would have known. The commander of a labor camp was a distant figure, not somebody who hobnobbed with the prisoners. And so I began with just this name, Major Plagge, and he worked in vehicle repairs in Vilnius from 1941 to 1944. And I began to write letters. I wrote to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I wrote to Yad Vashem in Israel. I wrote to the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. No one had heard of him. No one had heard of this story. No one knew this man. So I kept on writing. And because of the power of the internet, I was able to send letters, and they would be passed from person to person. And over time, my letters began to circulate the globe. And one of my letters left my home in Durham, Connecticut, and it went up to a Jewish genealogist interested in the genealogy of Vilnius, who lived in Massachusetts. And he sent it to a man in Montevideo, Uruguay. And this man in Montevideo, Uruguay, thought of his uncle, Saul, who lived in Hamburg. Now, Solomon Klasko had been born in Uruguay and was a leftist. And when the right-wing junta took control of his country in the 1970s, he had to flee for his life. And he came to Hamburg, Germany, where he where he's a mathematician and started a startup company called Lopos. So one day, Solomon Klasko is sitting at his computer, and up pops this email sent to him by his nephew, which tells his story of a place that he's very interested in. He's very interested in Vilnius. His family is from Vilnius. He's been to Vilnius. And there's this man from Connecticut who claims that there was a Wehrmacht major who was busy saving Jews in this town that his family's from. And he thought this was a very interesting story. So he turned to his business partner, Jörg Fiebelkorn, who is here with us tonight, and is one of the big heroes of this story. And he showed this letter to Jörg. Now, Jörg is a retired colonel from the modern German army. He had served with many veterans of World War II. And he always suspected that when they said that they had no choice, that they had to take part in the partisan wars, which is what they called the genocide, that if they didn't take part in these partisan wars, that they too would have been killed. But Jörg knew from his studies and research into history that there had never been a single Wehrmacht soldier who was court-martialed or prosecuted for refusing to shoot innocent civilians. And so he always suspected that what these officers said wasn't true. And here he saw a very interesting story. A staff officer, like he had been, who had been in Vilna and was working to save Jews. So he decided to help. And so he wrote to the Bundesarchiv to see if he could get some information about Karl Plagge. Now, I had also written to the Bundesarchiv, but they wouldn't answer me. I was an ignorant American. I didn't understand that things in Germany are not the same as they are in the United States. In the United States, if you walk into a public building, you can go and look at anybody's records. I can go into our town hall, I can open up the land records, find out how much my neighbor paid for their house, how much taxes they pay, how much a mortgage they carry, how many times they second mortgage. Everything is open, unless something is labeled secret. So I thought the whole world was like this, but I didn't know that unless you were a family member or someone who had a right to know, that you couldn't go poking around in someone's military records. But Jörg, he teaches at the War College in Hamburg, so he has a right to know. And when he wrote to the Bundesarchiv in Aachen, they said, "Ah, yes, Plagge. There's some man from Connecticut who's been writing to us about him." So it was with Jörg's help that we were able to get the file of this Major Plagge, and we found out some very important details. We found that his name was Karl Plagge, that he was from Darmstadt, Germany, and he was born in 1897. And with this information, we are able to then approach the city government at Darmstadt to try to open up his city files. And we also were able to discover through his archives here in Darmstadt that he had been a veteran of World War I, that he had graduated from the Technical University of Darmstadt in 1924 with a degree in engineering. So Solomon and Jörg wrote to their friends in Darmstadt, Germany, and here at the Technical University, and we managed to attract the attention of Marianne Viefhaus, who is a retired archivist, and she too was very intrigued by this story. She had never heard of this previously unknown student who seemed to have done great things in Vilna, so she decided that she would lend us a hand. And she began to research the information at the university and any records here in Darmstadt. And she found that Karl Plagge had been employed at an engineering firm called Hessen Works here in Darmstadt, and that the firm was owned by a man named Kurt Hess. And so she looked up where this Kurt Hess lived in his records, and then she picked up a modern German telephone book and turned to the page of Hess's, and sure enough, there was still a Hess family living in Darmstadt at the same address. So she picked up the phone and she gave them a call. And she found that she was soon talking to an elderly woman who was Kurt Hess's daughter. And she told Marianne that yes, the family knew Karl Plagge quite well. She knew Karl Plagge. They were very close, the Plagges and the Hesses. But no, she didn't know anything about what he had done during the war. People in Germany didn't talk about the war in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so there wasn't really much that she could tell her. And because her husband was ill and she had to care for him, she had to get off the phone. But before she hung up, she told Marianne, and suddenly blurted out, that Karl Plagge was saved from accusation because he saved Jews in Vilna during the war. And then she hung up. So we were left with a mystery. Marianne was left with a mystery. What could she mean that he was saved from accusation? So she thought about this, and then she decided that he must have been accused of being a war criminal, and that perhaps he had a denazification file. And so she went to the state archives of Hess, and she began to look through the files, and she found that indeed that Karl Plagge had a denazification file, and that he had actually had a denazification trial in which a prosecutor tried to gather evidence that he may have committed crimes against humanity, and that the defendant and person in question would have to find people to testify on his behalf. And most importantly, Marianne Plagge found the trial transcript. And this trial transcript opened a worldview to our eyes that we hadn't been able to see before. Before, I had been busy going and interviewing camp survivors, like my mother, like Bill Begell, like Simon Malkes, who is here, and getting the perceptions and memories of the Jewish prisoners and what they thought was going on. But they really didn't know. They only knew that everywhere in Vilnius, everyone was dying. When the Germans occupied Vilna in June of 1941, there were 100,000 Jews in Vilna. 3 years later, when the Red Army arrived, only 2,000 were left alive. And during this first summer of 1941, over 50,000 Jews were killed in the forests of Panari. So the Jews knew that all around them, everyone was dying, and that this major seemed to be benevolent, and that anybody who stayed close to him didn't die. But they didn't know what he was thinking or what his motivations were. And with this trial transcript, we had the testimony of Karl Plagge himself. We had the testimony of his men in the HKP unit, his subordinate officers, and we had the testimony of his friends and neighbors like the Hesses. And this trial transcript finally gave us a view from the other side of the barbed wire to know what the men who were in this unit and the commander himself thought. And what we learned from the transcript was that Karl Plage had been a veteran of World War I. He had fought in the Battle of the Somme, Flanders, Verdun, and become a prisoner of war under the British, and did not return to Germany until 1920. When he came back to Germany, the country was in chaos. The economy was in ruins. He had always wanted to be a physician like his father and grandfather, but because of the family's economic situation, he wasn't able to take this course of study, which was longer and more expensive, and thus he had to take a shorter course of study in engineering. Even with an engineering degree, he was frequently unemployed. He didn't make enough money to be able to have a house of his own for him and his wife. He had to live with his mother, which was humiliating. And he, like millions of other Germans, soon became attracted to the message of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists. He believed Hitler's promise that he would rebuild German pride, rebuild the economy, bring order to the chaos that was in the streets. And Karl Plage joined the Nazi Party in 1931, and he became a precinct leader and helped bring them to power. And so he was active in the Nazi Party from 1931 until 1935. But as time went on, especially after Hitler came to power in 1933, Plage began to realize that these Nazis, there was some problems with them. First, he didn't like them personally. He found many of the party officials to be loudmouths and braggarts, which didn't suit his style, as he was a humble man. But most importantly, he was a trained scientist. He was an engineer, had a scientific training, and he didn't believe their racial and scientific theories, and he refused to teach them. And this caused increasing friction and conflict with the party officials, who were increasingly strident about the importance of these theories. And by 1935, when he continued to refuse to teach these theories that he didn't believe in, he was accused of being a friend of Jews and Freemasons and sidelined from the party leadership here in Darmstadt. Also in the mid-1930s, he was hired by Hessen Works and befriended Kurt Hess. Kurt Hess was married to a woman who was 1/4 Jewish, and as such, Mr. Hess was being persecuted by the local party leaders who wanted him to divorce his wife or threatened to declare his business a Jewish business that would be under boycott. Mr. Hess was hopeful that having a Nazi party member like Karl Plage in his firm would help protect the firm. So, as he befriended the Hesses, he could see what hardships they had, that they were threatened, that they were nervous, and after the Kristallnacht riots and pogroms here in Darmstadt, 2 weeks later, the Hesses gave birth to a infant boy, Konrad Hess, and in violation of the Nuremberg laws, Karl Plage became the godfather of this young 1/8 Jewish infant, and was hoping to lend some protection given his status as an early party member. As the 1930s went on, Karl Plage soon realized that Adolf Hitler was planning on starting a Second World War, and he was horrified at the thought. He had survived the worst and thickest of fighting during World War I, and he had no disillusions of what horror war could cause. But in 1939, war did start, and he indeed was drafted into the Wehrmacht, and he was put in charge of a engineering unit, HKP 562, and he soon found himself in Vilnius, or Vilna as it was called then, and saw the genocide occurring all around him. I think it's important to see that his reaction was different. He didn't zip his mouth. He didn't be quiet and just try to survive. But rather, he looked at what was going on around him, the horrors that was going around him, and he felt responsible. He understood that he had helped these criminals come to power, and when he saw the results, the monster that had been created, he decided that it was his duty to help the beleaguered Jews of Vilna and to try to help them survive. And so he began to get to work. And what did he do? First, he had an engineering unit which repaired motor vehicles, damaged vehicles from the Eastern Front. And they needed slave laborers. And so he began to give work permits to Jews, specifically to Jews. Some of them were skilled, some of them were not, certifying them as skilled and essential laborers for the Werkmacht. Such a work permit would protect the laborer himself, as well as his wife and 2 of his children. So this is how my grandfather, an intellectual, my grandfather really, he couldn't screw in a light bulb. And yet he was certified as an essential worker in the Plagge's workshops. And he gave out 250 of these work permits. He once told Gershon Reches, whose son Isaac is here with us, that he specifically gave work permits to Jews because they were the most endangered and periled people in Vilna at the time. And in addition to this, he also looked out after the Jews, tried to get them extra food rations. Sometimes some of the Jews would be snatched by Lithuanian SS who would sweep through the ghetto and would take them to Lukishki prison. And he would send, when he would hear of some of his workers being captured, he would send his men or go personally to Lukishki prison and insist that these were essential workers and that they had to be freed. And so from the summer of 1941 until September of 1943, for 2 years, he kept these 1,000 Jewish workers and their family members safe from the actions that swept through the ghetto and killed the vast majority of Jews. In September of 1943, only 15,000 Jews were left in the Vilna ghetto. And on September 1st, the SS came into the ghetto and began to grab Jews, whether they had work permits or not. And 100 of Plagge's workers were captured on their way to the HKP workshops and put on a cattle car destined for the slate mines of Estonia. When Plagge heard this, he sent his men to the cattle cars and unloaded his workers and brought them back to the ghetto. But then, when the head of the SS in Vilna heard that Plagge had done this, he sent his SS troops into the ghetto and recaptured these men and put them back on the cattle cars. And a very bitter argument ensued between the SS commander and Plagge. And in the end, these 100 workers were sent to their deaths in the slate mines of Estonia. So Plagge began to understand that the methods that he'd been using for the previous 2 years were no longer adequate. And thus, he made extraordinary efforts, traveling to Riga, to Kovno, and doing some very adept bureaucratic maneuvering to insist that his unit could not perform their tasks without these workers, and that he was vital to the war effort on the Eastern Front. And he somehow managed to persuade his superiors, both in the Wehrmacht and the SS, to allow him to form a freestanding HKP camp on the outskirts of town on Suboc Street. And thus it was that 1 week before the Vilna ghetto was liquidated and the rest of the Jews deported to either death camps or slave labor camps, that Karl Plagge came into the Vilna ghetto in the middle of the night with trucks and loaded 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children and took them to the relative safety of his camp. And this alone is probably the single greatest deed that Karl Plagge performed, because all the Jews were sure that they were doomed. They knew after the Estonian action that their work permits didn't protect them anymore, and that they and their families were doomed. And suddenly a ray of hope appeared. Karl Plagge came into the ghetto and brought them to safety. Now in the HKP camp, the Jews were relatively safe. Plagge's men, the HKP 562 soldiers, were in charge of the camp and the work that went on there. He made sure that there were adequate food rations and also allowed a very active black market so that there was no starvation in this camp. He instructed his officers and men that there was to be no brutality, that the civilians were to be treated with respect. And one of the very interesting aspects of this story, and one that I'm actually hoping that will evolve even more during my visit and to Darmstadt here, is the question of the men. From the denazification trial, we can see that Plagge's officers and men, 250 in all, were aware of what he was doing. The officers said in the trial that they could see that many of these Jews had no skills, and they could see that many of these women and children who Plagge put to work repairing damaged uniforms were really had very low skill levels and were not that productive. So here you had a unit of 250 Wehrmacht soldiers who was aware that their commander was trying to deceive the will of the SS and the genocide that was being carried out, and yet they went along. And it's my hope that over time we will be able to meet some of either the men or their families and learn more about what they thought, what did they think their risks were. And so we'll see whether this is a part of the tale that continues. Now, Karl Plagge may have been in charge of the camp, but he was not really in control of his Jewish prisoners. The prisoners were owned by the SS, and they were rented to the Wehrmacht or to any clothing manufacturer who wanted to use them for slave labor. So the SS had split motivations. On the one hand, they were very ideologically committed to eliminating the Jews from the face of Europe. On the other hand, they were corrupt and greedy and didn't mind lining their pockets with the rent that you could get from such slave labor. And Plagge played this greed aspect very carefully, and we have found letters with the help of our friends in Vilnius and with the help of Jörg Fiebelkorn. When I first saw these letters, which were written between the SS commander in Kaunas and Karl Plagge and the quartermaster's office in Vilnius, all these bureaucratic letters, and they're all very polite, and everybody's very helpful and nice to each other. And I couldn't understand why everybody, the Plagge and the SS were talking so nicely to each other. But Jörg helped me to see that between the lines there was a lot of tension and maneuvering and high drama. But the fact was that Plagge didn't own his slave laborers. In spite of the fact that he tried to gain control of them, he failed. They were owned by the SS, who could do what they wanted. And there were two instances during the time at the Suboc Street camp when the SS did perform atrocities. Once they captured a couple and their child who were trying to escape, David Vzalkind and his family, and they held a public execution where they were hung before all the other prisoners, a man, a woman, and a 7-year-old child. And then, most terribly, on March 27th, 1944, when Plagge was away at home on leave, the SS came into the camp, as they came into all the camps in Lithuania, and took as many children as they could find and took them out of the camp and killed them. And thus it was that almost 90% of the children of HKP perished soon after March 27th, 1944. A few children, probably somewhere between 15 and 20, some of whom are now sitting in the room around us, managed to hide and escape from this action. And so it was clear that the SS could really do what they wanted with their Jews. And as the summer of 1944 approached and the Soviet army began to get closer and closer to Vilnius, the prisoners realized that they were in great danger. That they had heard on the BBC radio that whenever the Germans retreated, that before the final troops left an area, that the SS sent killing squads into any labor camp and killed any remaining Jews. So they understood that there was this time of liberation was going to be a time of great danger. And the question that they had was when? That if you had an escape plan or you had a hiding place, a small space that you could crouch in and hide and conceal yourself, if you had no food, if you had no water, you had no toilet facilities, the question was, how long could you stay there? 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. So the timing was of essence. You had to know when. So on July 1st, 1944, Karl Plage came in to the HKP camp. He had an SS officer, Richter, at his side, and he made a little speech to the assembled Jews who gathered around him, an informal speech. And he said, well, as you know, the fortunes of war have changed, and the Wehrmacht is going to relocate my unit, HKP 562, to the west. I had wanted to take you, my very skilled prisoners, with me, but unfortunately this was not possible. But not to worry, you too will be relocated, and during your relocation you will be escorted by the SS, which, as you know, is an organization devoted to the protection of refugees. Thus, there's nothing to worry about. So when the Jews heard this, they knew the time of danger was now. And that night, the night of July 1st to July 2nd, 1944, over half of the 1,000 prisoners either made escape attempts to climb over the wire and run away, or go into pre-prepared hiding places. And when the SS killing squads came into the camp the next morning and had a roll call, they were only able to find 500 of the 1,000 Jewish prisoners, and they took these people immediately to Ponari, the killing grounds outside of Vilnius, where they were shot and murdered. They then spent 3 days searching the camp and its surroundings, and succeeded in finding another 250 of the Jewish escapees, and shot them in the courtyard of the HKP camp. But in all, 250 of Plage's prisoners ultimately survived the Holocaust. They are the single largest group of Jewish survivors from all of Vilna. Those of us who have family members who are among those survivors and are looking back at this story have to wonder, well, what are we to make of this story? Why do we care in the year 2005 about what happened 60 years ago? I mean, obviously I care. I mean, I wouldn't be here if these events hadn't had, but why should the general public, why would I write a book about it? What are we to think? And I think there's several interesting aspects. First of all, Plage took responsibility for his actions. He may have made mistakes. He may have helped the Nazi Party come to power, but he didn't make excuses for himself. He didn't say, I was tricked, I was deceived, I didn't understand. He said, I helped create this monster, I take responsibility for my own mistakes, and I'm going to work to undo them. And I think that this is something that all of us, when we try to make excuses for ourselves, could do well to emulate. Secondly, I think it's important to see that Karl Plage did not follow his leaders. He didn't listen to what he was supposed to do. And when he saw things that he was uneasy about, he didn't follow his peers. He didn't look at his fellow soldiers to see what they were doing. He looked inside. He followed his own inner moral compass. And by looking inside, he decided that this was wrong and he wasn't going to do it. And for those of us humans throughout the world, whether we're being led by George Bush or Osama bin Laden or any leader in the world, we have to always remember that just because our leader is rallying us to go in a certain direction, we need to look inside and ask ourselves, is this the right thing to do? Another aspect that I am very interested in is that Plage tried not to break rules. He tried not to take risks. He later wrote in a letter to some HKP survivors that testified on his behalf at his denazification trial that what I was able and allowed to do was only what any decent person would do for fellow human beings in distress. And notice that he says what I was able and allowed to do. And he always said that that he did much too little, that he should have done more. And he insisted that he was no big rifle-waving type of hero. He said, I am basically no hero. I'm actually a very nervous person. And for those of us who feel in our hearts that we are probably ordinary, like I myself don't think that I'm braver than average, and we often wonder, well, what good can we do in the world? We're so meek, we're so nervous. And yet here was a very nervous person, and he shows us that even someone who inside feels very nervous can look around them and by playing by the rules can manipulate the world that we all inhabit and have an effect on and change the world for the better. In closing, I'd like to read a quote from a letter that Karl Plage wrote, again to this family, that was staying in a DP camp in Stuttgart. And he wrote to them and said, "I believe that the time has come for all right-minded, well-disposed people to extend their hands to each other across national boundaries to form a community of the solitary among the nations. For whoever seeks truth and justice today remains solitary in the midst of a blind multitude crying for power and violence." And it's my hope that those of us who carry this story forward will be able to tell this story of Karl Plage and the HKP Jews and help build a world in which men like Karl Plage no longer stand alone. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask my friend Jörg Fiebelkorn to come up and stand with me, and I'd be happy to take questions, and either I'll answer, or if it's something that it lies in Jörg's expertise, we'll hear his thoughts.
Well, there's a parallelism between the case of Plage and the case of Schindler. I'm sure you thought about it. There are also differences in site, Krakow and Vilnius, and in a civilian versus a military person. Do you have any comment?
Well, I do think that that one of the big differences was the fact that Karl Plage was a military man. He also didn't have the money to bribe everybody in the SS, which is what made Oskar Schindler ultimately more successful in the end. He was able to line a lot of pockets and thus save all 1,000 of his workers. And the other aspect that's a little bit different is that Plage had responsibility and carried on his shoulders not only the lives of these 1,000 Jews, but he also was responsible for the well-being of his men. And he was very concerned that he said, "I did not support this war and I don't want to further it," and he was very determined not to lose any men for what he thought was a criminal war. And this he was successful in. His HKP unit, he was able to carry them to the West and surrender them to the Americans in May of 1945 without the loss of a single soldier. And this was something that he was very proud of, and of course his men were very grateful for.
Yes, but what they both have in common, that is that they had the possibilities to help, both of them. And they are not many ones who didn't have those. Think.
The comment is that what both Schindler and Plage had was the possibility, the opportunity to help. And this was something that most Germans didn't find themselves to have such an opportunity. You have any thoughts on that?
The difference is that Schindler started it as a business venture, whereas Plage had no other motivation than humanitarian reasons.
Yeah. What my father is saying is that Schindler originally came as a war profiteer, looking for money, and later became, had a change of heart and decided to save his Jews. Whereas Karl Plage was a military man, he had no personal profit motive, and when I first started this search, some of my family's friends who were survivors would say to me, "Well, I think you're going a little bit too far. he must have had his reasons for, for protecting the Jews. He had a cushy job behind the lines. It was very nice being so far behind the Russian front. Maybe he was doing all this to save his own skin, or maybe he knew that the war was lost and he needed a few happy Jews to testify on his behalf. But the fact is that we found that he began his efforts in the summer of 1941, when Germany looked like it was going to conquer the world. So this was not a last-minute appearance. What's more, we also found that he had suffered from polio during his time as a prisoner of war and was partially disabled and was not fit for frontline duty. There's, I think, good evidence that he did this out of conviction and not secondary gain.
Lassen Sie mich noch eins dazu ergänzen. Karl Plagge war eben als Soldat eingebunden in eine sehr enge und straffe Organisation, nämlich das Militär. Und er hat innerhalb des Militärs seinen Handlungsspielraum ausgeschöpft. Und jeder deutsche Offizier hatte diesen selben Handlungsspielraum. Es gibt das Zeugnis eines anderen HKP-Kommandanten aus dem gleichen Instandsetzungsregiment wie das von Plagge. Und dieser Mann sagt, man kann die Juden prügeln, quälen, aufhängen, erschießen, sie arbeiten trotzdem nicht schneller. Daran können Sie ermessen, wie breit der Handlungsspielraum war. Und wenn ein Soldat innerhalb des Militärs diesen Handlungsspielraum hatte, wie groß war dann erst der Handlungsspielraum, der jedem einzelnen Zivilisten zur Verfügung stand? Und genau das ist die Frage, die uns beschäftigen sollte. Vor allen Dingen vor dem Hintergrund eben genau der Frage, konnten sie helfen oder konnten sie nicht helfen? Karl Plagge ist vielleicht, gerade weil er Soldat war, das beste Beispiel dafür, dass man helfen konnte, und zwar effizient helfen konnte.
Jörg, man muss vielleicht dazu fügen, Plagge war nicht der einzige. Manche andere Soldaten, die nicht Majoren oder Hauptmanns wären, haben viele Juden geholfen.
Hierzu müsste eigentlich Marianne Viefhaus antworten, da sie in der Arbeitsgruppe von Professor Wette mitgearbeitet hat. Es gibt ungefähr 100 Beispiele aus der Wehrmacht von Soldaten, die Verfolgten geholfen haben. 100 von etwa 12 Millionen Soldaten. 100 haben die Zivilcourage gezeigt, zu helfen, wo sie helfen konnten. Es mag ein paar Fälle mehr geben, die nicht bekannt geworden sind, aber so wenige sind es einfach. Es sind nur so wenige.
Aber es gab noch einen Darmstädter und das war der Herr Hosenfeld, auch Offizier. Hosenfeld hieß er und die Familie, die Tochter lebt noch hier in Darmstadt. Ich weiß nicht, ob sie inzwischen gestorben ist, ehrlich gesagt. Aber die Tochter lebt noch. Und wir haben das auch gehört von ihm. Der hat in Polen geholfen, in Warschau. Hat er allen, die Juden, auch alle beschäftigt in seiner Nähe, um zu helfen, um sie zu retten.
Der Fall Hosenfeld ist in dem Buch Zivilcourage, herausgegeben von Professor Wette, erwähnt und ist einer von eben jenen 100.
Aber Malkes hat, Entschuldigung, der hat gerade gesagt, dass diese Familie Kaczynski oder Paschinski oder Paschkowski ihr Leben und das Wohl der ganzen Familie riskiert hat. Und das war so. Das war so. Also das darf man nicht ignorieren. Ich meine, in unserer eigenen Familie, meine Mutter hat auch ihre jüdische Freunde. Aber das darf man ja heute gar nicht sagen.
Ein Wort dazu. Die deutsche Militärjustiz hat es fertiggebracht, 2 Divisionen auszurotten. 40.000 vollstreckte Todesurteile gehen auf das Konto der deutschen Militärjustiz. Die Masse dieser Urteile wegen Nichtigkeiten und wegen sogenannter Zersetzung. Das bedeutet, dass jeder Soldat, der irgendwie in Gefahr geriet oder irgendwie in den Geruch geriet, ein Feind der Nazis zu sein, vor den nimmermüden Feldjägern und der nimmermüden Militärjustizmaschine keine Chance hatte. 40.000 Urteile sind dokumentiert. Wir wissen, dass eine große Anzahl dieser Akten nach dem Kriege von eben denselben Militärrichtern vernichtet worden sind. Wir wissen, dass eben dieselben Militärrichter die Entnazifizierungsverfahren geführt haben. Wir wissen, dass eben dieselben Militärrichter nach dem Kriege Dekane an Universitäten wurden, Mitglieder des Bundesgerichtshofs und einer ist bis zum Ministerpräsidenten eines Bundeslandes gebracht hat.
And you
Sorry.
You should point out that in all of World War II, the U.S. military executed one soldier.
One.
For desertion.
In World War I, the German military sentenced 135 soldiers to death, and only a few of them were really shot, while the French army shot some hundreds for treason.
My father was in HKP from the first days.
Okay, I'll repeat the question.
My father, who passed away 2 years ago, he was in HKP from the beginning. He was an expert on changing the use of the weapon, what you said, in the Panzerkaserne. He was there. And he was
from benzene to Holz.
She's saying that her father was, who died 2 years ago, was a prisoner at HKP from the very beginning. He was an expert in helping convert the engines from benzene to wood-burning engines.
Holzgasgeneratoren.
And he was 20 years old then, and through the opportunity to save people by being married to a wife and having 2 kids, he was married, so-called, to a woman. She was 36 years old and she had a 6-year-old boy. And I know from other people from HKP, because I'm very well acquainted with them, that sometimes there was a family that the mother had her elder son, he was 17 years old, it's Familie Katz, as her husband, and the 2 younger children were her kids. He made all sorts of manipulations.
Fictive marriages.
Yes, to enable as many people to survive and to stay alive. And my father escaped from HKP with his 17 people he was responsible for after Plagge said that the SS would take over. And he cut the wires and they escaped. So, and I'm familiar with all the stories, and I know many people, it's a shame you didn't get in touch with them in Israel, that knew the stories, and most of them aren't alive anymore, but they were.
That's right. So what she's saying is that there were many aspects of the way that the Jews got into the camp that were obviously not right. That was very clear. Her father was 20 years old, and he listed a woman who was 36 as being his wife, and she had a 7-year-old son. It was very clear that a 20-year-old man couldn't have a 7-year-old son, and yet these things were allowed to pass without any objection. And I think that it's also true that there were never any searches of the camp. The Jews were busy building hiding places because they knew the SS would eventually come. No one has ever heard a story that the guards were very upset that they were making escape plans or making hiding places. The premises were never searched. They were riddled with hiding places. And this guest also says that there are many people in Israel who I did not contact, who I just met this week actually, who have similar stories. And one of the things that made this story so difficult is that the Jews who were in this camp had no ties to each other. They were from all strata of society. Some of them were even not from Vilnius. And when the Germans retreated and they left the camp, they scattered over the corners of the globe. And there was no organization that coordinates them. And so many of the families in New York and Los Angeles, Montreal, know only a handful of other survivors or no other survivors. When this story came out in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, there was a man who was 12 years old in HKP and came to New York and had always told his family of this benevolent major who had saved his life and his parents. And this family thought this was their personal, story that nobody else knew about. And when they were sitting eating breakfast and reading the newspaper about this story of Major Plagge being honored at Yad Vashem, they almost choked on their breakfast. And the wife was sputtering and telling him to hurry up and read this story because it was their story. And I think that as we get more and more publicity about this case, we have more and more people who come forward and have their pieces to add. And just as we have the HKP survivors coming forward, we're also hopeful to hear from some of the men from the HKP unit. In fact, tomorrow, the daughter of one of Plagge's soldiers is coming to the ceremonies and is very eager to talk to us and tell us what her father had to say about those years. Oh, okay.
I'd like to say that during his famous speech, and I was there, people around, and there are about 300 people who were listening to Major Plagge speak, asked him some questions, just like you are asking Michael some questions now. And I remember well that one woman said, "And how much stuff will we be allowed to take with us during the evacuation?" And Major Plagge looked at her and said, "I don't think that you will need much," which was again a very important signal to all of us. Run. That's what I did.
What I would like to add, kann ich auch Deutsch sprechen, wenn Sie wollen. Wir brauchten wirklich nicht viele Hints zu haben, um zu wissen, dass eines Tages die Ende sein wird. Warum? Einfach, wir haben unheimlich viele Hiding Places, wir nannten das Balines, um sich zu verstecken. Zum Beispiel mein Vater und viele andere haben ein Jahr lang Nächte solche Malines gebaut, eines Tages wussten wir, wir werden das brauchen, um sich zu verstecken. In anderen Worten, für manchen Leuten muss man sagen, ja, das war nett, er hat uns ein Hint gegeben, hier weißt ihr was zu tun. Andere sagten, mit dem Hint oder ohne dem, wir hatten unsere Malinen vorbereitet und das war der Tag, wenn Plagge weg ist, wenn die Wehrmacht weg ist und die Russen waren, die russische Rote Armee war 20 Kilometer aus Wilna, 10 Tage entfernt, hätten das keine 10 Tage gewesen, sondern ein Monat, da wären die 250 Leute nicht am Leben gewesen. Weil in diesen Malinen konnte man nicht länger wie 3, 4, Maximum 5 Tage überleben. Ich mit meinem Vater sind aus dieser Maline raus. Das war der zweite Tag. Man konnte nicht mehr überleben. Wir hatten kein Wasser, wir hatten keine Luft. Das war furchtbar. Einer ist ganz Meshuggah geworden. Die Bayern wissen, was Meshuggah ist.
Ja, auch.
Sie auch. Braucht man kein Bayer zu sein. Und der hat mit einem Messer mein Vater hier gestochen. Oh, entschuldige, Marianne. Ich wollte dich nicht stechen. Und eine Dame auch. Wenn ich spreche mit meinen Händen, ich bin doch Italiener. Wusstest du das nicht? Ein Italiener fragt ihn, warum willst du nicht zum Kampf gehen? Warum willst du dich nicht schlagen, sagt er. Wenn ich meine Hände verliere, wie kann ich dann sprechen? Also wir sind raus mit meinem Vater, wir waren in einem Feld, ich habe seine Hose runtergezogen, die Hose ist stehen geblieben, so viel Blut war da. Nach 2 Tagen war das unmöglich, da drin zu sein. Also Sie sehen, wie wir vorbereitet waren, dass eines Tages eine Flucht, er hatte viel Glück, um fliegen zu können, weil er war ein junger Mann von 15, 17 Jahren. Manche waren kleiner, ich war ein bisschen kleiner. Er ist ja alt gegenüber mich. Nicht einverstanden. Ich mache Spaß. Aber mein Vater konnte nicht laufen. Und damals, litauische Soldaten waren noch da und die haben angefangen zu schießen. Also manche Leute sind weggelaufen, manche haben sich wieder versteckt und für noch einen Tag oder zwei. Über Plagge muss ich noch ein Wort sagen, wenn ich darf. Plagge hat meine Mutter in ein Spital in der Stadt genommen und meine Mutter ist 6 Monate lang in dem Spital in der Stadt da geblieben und die Ärzte haben gesagt, bleiben Sie hier, wenn Sie dahin gehen, sind Sie kaputt. Vielen Dank.
Jörg would like to make one more comment and then we'll break it up.
Nach dieser Kinderaktion, das war am Tag nach Purim, die Kinder hatten eine Aufführung gemacht, die Feldwebel der Plagges Einheit waren bei dieser Aufführung dabei gewesen, hatten sich mit den Kindern gefreut. Und am nächsten Morgen kam die SS und hat die Kinder eingesammelt, etliche Mütter dazu, etliche ältere Leute, ungefähr 170 Personen, um sie umzubringen. Aus den Appelllisten geht hervor, dass für mehrere Tage danach im HKP nicht gearbeitet wurde. In welchem KZ wäre es denkbar gewesen, dass nach einer Mordaktion für ein paar Tage völlige Ruhe herrscht? Vielleicht sagt so etwas eine Menge über den Einfluss von Plagge auf seine Einheit und auf die Art, wie er sie geführt hat, aus. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing some time with me.